How do you make an enemy who has been fighting in the same jungle for 20 years suddenly afraid to go outside at night? Not with bombers, not with artillery, not with the 500,000 soldiers that the most powerful nation on earth had already committed to the effort and watched fail. You do it with 5 men who have not bathed in 3 days, who move so slowly through the darkness that it takes them 9 hours to cover a single mile of terrain, and who smell so completely like the rotting floor of the jungle itself that an enemy tracker can press his face 6 inches from where one of them is hiding and detect absolutely nothing. 5 men, no heavy weapons, no air support on call, no plan to fight their way out if things went wrong. The Viet Cong had a name for them. They called them Ma Rung. It translates roughly as the phantoms of the jungle, but that translation loses something critical, because the Vietnamese word the fighters used was not the word for ghost in a metaphorical sense. It was the word for a thing that should not exist, a thing the jungle itself had produced, something that could not be explained by the normal rules of the war they thought they were fighting. Before you watch what follows, tell me in the comments, had you ever heard of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment before today? Because what you are about to discover will change how you think about what military excellence actually looks like. Watch until the end. The final chapter of this story is the part that the history books buried deepest. To understand why 5 men covered in mud and fermented fish sauce became the most feared unit in the Vietnamese jungle, one must first understand the colossal machinery that was failing all around them. The American military of 1966 was not an incompetent force. By almost every measurable standard, it was the most powerful army ever assembled on the surface of the earth. It deployed 500,000 soldiers across the length of South Vietnam. It had more helicopters than many nations had aircraft of any kind. Its artillery could reduce a grid square to rubble in under 4 minutes. Its bombers could flatten a forest and everything living inside it before the target's commanding officer had time to look up from his maps. The doctrine that governed how all this power was used had been refined over 2 decades of post-war planning, war-gamed across multiple continents, tested in training exercises from the Mojave Desert to the forests of West Germany, and approved by the most credentialed military minds that the United States could produce. On paper, it was a doctrine that should have ended the Vietnam War before the rainy season of 1966. The doctrine rested on 3 assumptions that its architects treated as laws of physics. First, that overwhelming firepower decided outcomes, that an enemy who absorbed enough ordnance would eventually cease to function as a fighting force. Second, that helicopter mobility gave American forces an unbeatable advantage in finding and engaging an enemy that tried to hide, that speed and reach would compensate for the absence of a fixed front line. Third, that technological superiority, thermal sensors, motion detectors, chemical sniffers, communications intercept equipment worth billions of dollars, could locate any hostile force anywhere on the battlefield before that force had time to prepare. These were not unreasonable assumptions in the context of the wars they had been designed for. In Korea, against a conventional army fighting along established front lines, the doctrine had worked adequately. The generals in Washington saw no compelling reason to redesign a system that had performed in the most recent major conflict they had fought. The doctrine had institutional momentum. It had budget lines behind it. It had the careers of thousands of senior officers invested in its correctness. It had everything, except the ability to defeat an enemy that refused to fight the war it had been designed to win. The Viet Cong had already written the counter-argument before American boots touched Vietnamese soil in any significant number. Their commanders had studied American doctrine with the careful attention of students who know their entire future depends on the answer, and they had identified the single point of catastrophic failure at the center of the American system. The entire edifice depended on one thing and one thing alone: the ability to call in air support and artillery at the moment of contact. Remove that ability, and the doctrine did not just weaken. It collapsed entirely, because it had been built on the assumption of that capability, the way a building is built on its foundation. Remove the foundation, and there is no building. Remove the air support, and there was no American tactical advantage. The counter-tactic that emerged from this analysis was so simple it bordered on elegant. When contact was made, rather than retreating from American firepower the way conventional military logic would suggest, Viet Cong fighters would charge directly toward the Americans, closing the distance to 20 meters, then 15, sometimes 10. At 10 meters, no American pilot could drop ordnance without killing his own men. At 15 meters, artillery was equally useless, the trajectory of the shells requiring a minimum distance to arm and detonate safely. The Americans called this tactic hugging, as if the enemy were being affectionate. What they were doing was turning the most expensive investment in American military history into dead weight and circling metal. The trillion-dollar Air Force circled overhead, its pilots watching the jungle below without being able to intervene, while the fighting happened beneath the canopy at ranges where the most primitive weapons in either army were every bit as lethal as the most sophisticated. Research conducted by the Australian Army Research Centre found that in the Vietnamese jungle, more than half of all ambushes were triggered at ranges of 15 meters or less, and nearly 80% of all contacts occurred within 30 meters of the enemy position. More than 3/4 of all firefights were over within 20 minutes, and approximately half were concluded within 5 minutes from the first shot. At these distances and durations, the vast and expensive American support apparatus was not merely underutilized, it was structurally irrelevant to the actual fighting. Artillery responding to a call for fire took 10 minutes to place rounds on target under the best possible conditions. By the time those rounds arrived, the fight was over. The men who had been fighting were either already dead, already wounded, or already gone back into the jungle from which they had come. The Americans kept escalating in response to this reality. More troops, more sorties, more technology, more money, as if the solution to a fundamental question of philosophy and terrain was simply a question of quantity. The doctrine had become a prison with invisible walls, and the men who administered it had lost the institutional capacity to imagine that the walls might not be necessary. In May of 1962, 4 years before the first Australian Special Forces soldiers landed in Vietnam, United States Secretary of State Dean Rusk attended an ANZUS meeting in Canberra and made an admission that was remarkable for its candor from a senior official of a superpower. The United States Armed Forces, he told his Australian hosts directly, knew very little about jungle warfare. This was not false modesty designed to flatter allies. The Americans had fought in jungles during the Second World War in the Pacific Theater, but had approached jungle fighting as a temporary adaptation of conventional warfare, rather than as a fundamentally distinct discipline with its own logic and requirements. The Australians, sitting across the table from Rusk, had spent the previous 14 years doing almost nothing but jungle warfare. They had been in Malaya since 1948, fighting a communist insurgency through some of the most demanding primary jungle on Earth. They were, at the moment Rusk made his admission, preparing to rotate through Borneo in support of Malaysia against Indonesian infiltration. What they had learned over those 14 years, what they had paid for in the lives of their soldiers and the exhaustion of their units, was that the jungle was its own science, with its own physics, its own logic, and its own philosophy. And the philosophy they had built from that experience was the exact inversion of the one the Americans were deploying at enormous expense and growing casualties. The expression at the center of that Australian philosophy had been taught to Commonwealth forces since the earliest days of the Malayan emergency,
and it came from a book written by a British officer who had spent 3.5 years hiding in the Malayan jungle during the Second World War. The jungle is neutral, not hostile, not friendly, neutral, a resource and an environment that belonged equally to whoever knew how to use it. The Americans had arrived in Vietnam treating the jungle as an obstacle to be defeated and destroyed, to be cleared by defoliants that poisoned the canopy from the air, burned by napalm that turned the undergrowth into temporary wastelands, blasted by bombs until the landscape itself submitted to the will of the army moving through it. The jungle had not submitted.
It had kept growing, absorbing every punishment, healing over every wound the Americans inflicted upon it, and hiding an enemy that moved through it like water moving through rock, finding the path of least resistance and arriving exactly where it intended to be. The men who would change the calculation in one specific province had not arrived yet, but they were coming, and they were bringing with them something that no amount of American money could purchase. 15 years of accumulated understanding of exactly what that philosophy required in practice. The Special Air Service Regiment of the Australian Army had not been born in Vietnam. By the time 3 Squadron touched down at Vung Tau on the 16th of June, 1966, the regiment was 9 years old and had already been tempered by 2 conflicts that most military historians in the Northern Hemisphere had barely noticed. It had been formally raised on the 25th of July, 1957, modeled directly on the British Special Air Service, whose jungle methods had broken the back of the communist insurgency in Malaya through patience and intelligence, rather than firepower and sweep operations. Its philosophical lineage stretched further back still, to Z Special Unit and M Special Unit, and the Coast Watchers of the Second World War. Australians who had operated behind Japanese lines for months and years at a time, surviving on fieldcraft and patience, and intimate knowledge of terrain in conditions that had killed less prepared men by the hundreds. The tradition of operating deep in hostile territory, unsupported, invisible, and effective, was not new to these soldiers when they arrived in Vietnam. It was 40 years old. It was hereditary. The Malayan emergency had provided the regiment's first examination. From 1948 to 1960, British and Commonwealth forces had fought a jungle insurgency in the dense rainforest of the Malay Peninsula against communist guerrillas who were masters of their own terrain and had the profound advantage of fighting a war of attrition against an enemy that needed to win decisively, while they needed only to avoid losing catastrophically. The lesson that emerged from that long, grinding campaign was brutal in its simplicity and its implications. Large formations moving through primary jungle telegraphed their presence to every living thing within earshot and beyond. Platoons and companies conducting sweeping searches through likely areas found empty camps, cold fires, and abandoned equipment. The enemy heard them coming from hundreds of meters away, watched them pass from positions concealed in the vegetation 5 meters from the patrol's line of march, and melted back into the forest before any contact could be made. The approach that worked, the only approach that produced consistent results against a skilled jungle adversary, was small patrols of 4 to 6 men, moving with the patience of men who understood that speed was the enemy of awareness, gathering intelligence about enemy patterns and routes and habits, and waiting for the moment when the tactical situation was so overwhelmingly in their favor that the outcome was as certain as circumstances in war ever permit. Borneo had been the final examination before Vietnam. In 1965 and 1966, as the Indonesian confrontation turned the long border between Malaysian Borneo and Indonesian Kalimantan into a covert killing ground, all 3 SASR squadrons rotated through operations so highly classified that the Australian government did not officially acknowledge they had occurred until years after the final shots were fired. Operation Claret the designation given to the cross-border raids that SASR patrols conducted into Indonesian territory, remained sealed at the highest security level for a generation. The men who went on those patrols did not discuss them publicly when they returned. But what they brought back from the Borneo jungle was worth more than any number of formal reports. One patrol in that campaign lasted 89 days without resupply from outside. 89 days in primary jungle, navigating entirely on foot through terrain that had no roads and few paths, carrying everything needed on their backs, crossing a border that officially did not exist into the sovereign territory of a nation with which Australia was not formally at war. These were not training exercises conducted under controlled conditions with safety protocols and scheduled extractions. They were the most demanding extended patrols in Australian military history at that point, and the men who completed them and survived emerged as the most capable jungle operators anywhere on Earth. Part of that capability had roots in a tradition considerably older than any modern army. In Malaya and then in Borneo, Commonwealth Special Forces had worked alongside indigenous trackers whose ability to read jungle terrain had been refined over generations in a landscape that offered no safety margin for error and no second chances for the incompetent. In Malaya, the SAS worked alongside Iban tribesmen from Borneo, men whose ancestors had been navigating and surviving in primary jungle for thousands of years before Europeans arrived to name the trees. A 1956 documentary of New Zealand SAS operations in Malaya shows the patrol's point man and describes him simply, the Iban tracker from Borneo, on the lookout for signs, moving silently, days on end, ever on guard, trying to be as invisible as possible. The Iban brought to the patrol a capability that no amount of equipment expenditure could replicate, and no formal training course could manufacture in the time available to conventional military planners. A fresh boot impression in soft earth told them not just that a man had passed, but how recently he had passed, how heavily he was loaded based on the depth of the impression and the compression of the soil beneath it, whether his gait suggested injury or fatigue or the particular purposeful stride of a man moving to a known destination. They could identify the difference in smell between undisturbed vegetation and vegetation that had been moved through within the previous 6 hours. They understood the subtle changes in bird behavior and insect sound that indicated human presence at distances where no visual confirmation was possible. They were not scouts in any conventional military sense of the word. They were readers of a manuscript written in a language that most armies had never considered worth the effort of learning. The SASR did not merely observe this capability with professional admiration. They absorbed it into their operational philosophy as a fundamental component of how small patrols operated in dense jungle, and they carried that understanding with them to Vietnam. When 3 Squadron arrived in Fuk Tui province in the southern summer of 1966, they brought all of this with them: the Malayan patience, the Borneo endurance, the tracker's understanding of a jungle that spoke continuously to those who knew the language. What they found waiting was a province that had been at war in one form or another for more than 20 years and showed no signs of exhaustion. Fuk Tui was the southernmost province in the 3rd Corps Tactical Zone, southeast of Saigon, a piece of geography that included coastline, rubber plantations, rice paddies, and some of the most challenging jungle terrain in all of Vietnam.
To the northeast, the Mae Tao Mountains rose from the lowland jungle floor in a series of ridges covered in triple canopy forest so dense that sunlight reached the ground only in fragments, and visibility in the undergrowth dropped to 20 meters in relatively open areas and to effectively nothing in the bamboo thickets that filled the valley floors between the ridges. The mountains were the Viet Cong's primary sanctuary in the province. They held the headquarters of the Viet Cong 5th Division,
the main communist military formation responsible for the entire region, and they possessed one tactical characteristic that made them nearly impregnable against conventional attack. They were beyond the maximum effective range of the artillery at the Australian base at Nui Dat, 8 kilometers north of Bahria. What happened in the Mai Tao happened entirely beyond the reach of the fire support that all conventional military doctrine treated as the foundation of any offensive action. It happened on the jungle's terms, which meant it happened on terms that favored whoever understood the jungle better. The primary adversary facing the Australians in the province was the 274th Viet Cong Regiment, a main force unit that at peak strength numbered approximately 2,000 men organized into 3 operational battalions. The regiment was not a static garrison defending fixed positions. It was a mobile strike force that moved continuously between its home base in Long Con province and the Hat Dik area in Ben Hoa, striking into Fuk Tui province when tactical opportunities presented themselves, and withdrawing back across the provincial boundary before conventional Allied forces could fix it in place and bring their firepower to bear. The regiment was a rumor made of armed men, present everywhere in the province's intelligence reporting, and pinned down nowhere on any map with sufficient precision to act upon.
American and South Vietnamese intelligence knew the regiment existed. They knew its approximate area of operations. They had intercepted radio communications that confirmed its presence and identified its general location. What they could not do, because no technology then available to them produced information at the required resolution, was determine precisely where it was on any given night, where it would be the following morning, or how to place a strike force at that location before the regiment moved again. In October of 1966, 2 months after the Battle of Long Tan, in which D Company of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, held off an assault by more than 2,000 Viet Cong fighters with artillery support and prevailed despite being outnumbered by a ratio that should have made survival impossible. Australian forces recovered something of extraordinary intelligence value. Among the dead and in the abandoned positions that Australian infantry searched after the battle, they found the personal diary of Nguyen Nam Hum, the deputy commander of the 274th Viet Cong Regiment. The diary was the first primary source document that allowed the Australians to hear the enemy's voice directly, to understand how the 274th perceived the Australians and what it was planning against them. Hung had been watching the Australian base at Nui Dat for weeks before Long Tan, mapping its defensive wire, recording the positions of machine gun posts, studying the patrol patterns of the battalions operating out of the base. He had been probing the perimeter at night with decoy lights designed to draw fire from the machine guns and reveal their exact positions before any attack.
Reading those pages, the Australian intelligence officers encountered something that clarified the nature of the contest they were in. The enemy was studying them with exactly the same methodical, patient attention they were beginning to bring to the jungle. 2 forces examining each other through vegetation and across wire, each trying to find the exploitable pattern in the other's behavior. The difference was that the Australians were about to become considerably more patient and considerably harder to find than anyone on either side had yet anticipated. The assigned role of the Special Air Service Regiment in Fuk Tui was not to fight. This statement required careful explanation whenever Australian methods were discussed with American counterparts, because it violated every instinct that had been trained into officers of a military culture that measured operational success in body counts and territory cleared. The regiment was the eyes and ears of the 1st Australian Task Force, not the sword, not the hammer, the eyes. 5-man patrols inserted by helicopter into areas where the enemy was known to operate, moving for 10 days at a time through territory the Viet Cong considered its own, without resupply from outside. gathering intelligence of a precision and specificity that no sensor system or aerial reconnaissance capability available to the Americans could begin to approach. They were not there to engage the 274th Regiment in a firefight. They were there to find it, to follow it over days and across distances, to map its bases and supply routes and patrol schedules, and to report all of this back to commanders who would then direct conventional forces and artillery strikes with the specific, coordinate-level precision that turned general knowledge of the enemy's presence into actionable targeting data. The intelligence was the weapon. The patrol was the instrument for gathering it.
This philosophy was expressed most clearly and most dramatically by Major Reginald Beasley, who commanded 3 Squadron during its second tour of Vietnam, beginning in February of 1969. Previous squadrons rotating through Vietnam had erected boards on the walls of their operational areas tracking enemy kills, a visible concession to the body count culture that had come to define American measurement of progress in the war and that infected every Allied unit in the country to some degree. Beasley arrived at Nui Dat and found those boards on his first day. He walked up to them and knocked them down. "We were not there to kill people, but to gain information," he stated to the men standing around him, with the flatness of a man who considered the point so fundamental it should not have required saying. His action was not universally popular among soldiers who had risked their lives in contacts and felt that their results deserved acknowledgement in some visible form. But over the following months, the intelligence that his squadron extracted from the Ma Tau Mountains and the Hat Dik and the river valleys of Fuk Tui would prove his principle correct in terms that even the most committed advocate of aggressive engagement could not argue away. An American liaison officer who arrived at Nui Dat in 1968 to observe Australian SAS operations came with 2 decades of professional military experience, service in Korea, multiple training rotations with NATO forces in West Germany, and the settled conviction that what he was about to observe would largely confirm his existing understanding of how elite special operations forces conducted themselves in the field. He was wrong about that in every particular. What he encountered over the following weeks was a progressive and systematic dismantling of every principle he had been trained to treat as foundational to effective military operations.
The patrol he observed on his first morning was in the final stages of preparing for a 10-day mission into the northern reaches of Fuk Tui province. There were no inspection lines with soldiers standing at attention while officers checked the security of their equipment. There were no standardized load plans being verified against a quartermaster's checklist. There were no briefings being conducted with aerial photographs and overlay maps spread across planning tables while commanders pointed to grid references and outlined phases of the operation. Instead, a sergeant was walking slowly down the line of 5 men and examining each one not for the presence of something, but for the complete absence of something. No soap, no deodorant, no shaving cream, no insect repellent, no traces of any chemical product that Western civilization had ever manufactured and applied to a human body. The men had not bathed in 3 full days, and this was a deliberate operational requirement written into the preparation protocol rather than a consequence of the difficulty of providing shower facilities in a combat zone. The preparation went considerably further than simple abstinence from hygiene products. Each soldier was actively applying a mixture to his exposed skin and to the fabric of his uniform. River mud, combined with crushed rotting leaves and vegetation collected from the jungle floor nearby, the decomposing organic material that gave the jungle floor its distinctive dark color and its specific smell, mixed with quantities of the fermented fish sauce that was as fundamental to Vietnamese cooking as salt was to any other cuisine. The men worked the mixture into their hair, into the creases of their necks, into the backs of their hands, into the collar and cuffs of their uniforms. Several of them were fighting with visible effort to suppress the urge to gag as they applied it to themselves.
The smell coming off the patrol was extraordinary in its intensity. Organic decay, fermentation, the specific combination of compounds that characterized the floor of the Vietnamese jungle in the rainy season. The American wrote in his field journal that the Australians appeared to be conducting some form of ritual preparation that had no basis in any military science or doctrine he had ever encountered. He was entirely wrong about the science, though his description of the process as ritual was not entirely inaccurate in the sense that it was a precise and carefully calibrated procedure that had to be executed correctly to produce its intended result. The explanation the sergeant provided when asked was patient and systematic. A Viet Cong tracker with experienced jungle senses and knowledge of his home terrain could detect the chemical signature of Western soap products from a distance downwind that made the question of visual detection irrelevant. The synthetic fragrance compounds that characterized every standard-issue American hygiene product were entirely artificial smells that nothing in the Vietnamese jungle produced naturally. To a trained nose moving through terrain where every smell was known and catalogued by years of experience, those compounds announced the presence of a foreign soldier with the same clarity that a radio transmission on a known frequency announced the presence of a communications post. American cigarettes created the same problem through a different mechanism. The processed tobacco in Marlboros and Lucky Strikes burned with an aromatic chemistry that was fundamentally different from the harsh, leaf-heavy smoke of locally rolled Vietnamese tobacco, and the difference was detectable at ranges that made the question of whether the soldiers were moving quietly largely beside the point, because they had already been identified before their sounds could be heard. Even the sweat of a man eating American military rations, the preserved meats and processed sugars and dairy products of standard-issue field food, carried a different metabolic signature in the compounds it produced than the sweat of a man living on rice and dried fish and local vegetables. The bacterial processes that metabolized the sweat of the two men produced different breakdown compounds at the molecular level. Those compounds produced different detectable odors. To an experienced tracker in a silent jungle where no ambient noise masked the information available to the nose, those odors were as precise and identifying as a uniform or a flag. The officer wrote everything down in his journal with the careful attention of a professional. His expression gave nothing away. He turned his attention to the weapons and equipment the patrol was carrying, expecting to find the compensating technological advantage that must, he reasoned, explain whatever effectiveness these soldiers had demonstrated, since the preparation he had just observed clearly could not be the genuine explanation. What the SASR carried into the jungle, and more precisely, what it had chosen with great deliberation not to carry, was the second dismantling of his assumptions. An American Special Forces patrol preparing for an extended mission behind enemy lines was a mobile fortress, a self-contained weapons system capable of sustaining a significant firefight with organic resources if resupply and extraction became impossible. Standard loadout for a 10-day operation included an M16 automatic rifle, a .45 caliber pistol in a hip holster, multiple fragmentation grenades on the belt, smoke canisters for marking positions for aircraft, claymore mines for establishing defensive perimeters at night, extra magazines for the rifle stuffed into every available pouch, a PRC-25 radio strapped to the back weighing more than 20 pounds, a comprehensive medical kit including morphine and battlefield dressings, and enough dry rations to sustain the soldier for the duration of the mission. The total weight of this loadout, when fully assembled, frequently exceeded 40 kilograms per man. The philosophy animating it was simple and, in its own terms, rational.
Carry everything you might conceivably need, because the alternative is running out of something critical at the moment you need it most. And in a firefight behind enemy lines, with no immediate prospect of resupply, that moment ends careers and lives simultaneously. The patrol assembling in front of the American looked, on first inspection, like men preparing for a brief local patrol rather than a 10-day deep reconnaissance mission into the mountains that served as the enemy's primary sanctuary. The L1A1 self-loading rifles that were the standard SASR weapon had been extensively modified by the unit's own armorers in ways that would have resulted in formal disciplinary proceedings in any conventionally administered unit. The flash suppressors had been removed from every weapon in the patrol. The suppressors added weight that served no useful purpose in close jungle work, and more critically, they added length to the barrel assembly, and length in dense vegetation meant additional opportunities for the muzzle to catch on a branch or a vine or the edge of a palm frond, with a sound that would carry in complete jungle silence for distances that made the question of camouflage irrelevant.
Both problems resolved simultaneously with a hacksaw and a file. The armorers had also modified the selector mechanisms on each rifle to permit full automatic fire, a capability that American fire discipline doctrine treated as a violation of sound marksmanship principles, and that the SASR treated as an essential survival tool for the specific tactical situation these patrols regularly encountered. The reasoning behind the full automatic modification was the philosophical inversion that sat at the center of everything the regiment did in the Vietnamese jungle. The principle that made 5 men more effective than 500 if the 5 men understood it and the 500 did not. These patrols existed to avoid contact entirely. Their entire purpose was to move through enemy territory without the enemy knowing they were there, to gather intelligence of the quality that only sustained close-range observation over multiple days can produce, and to extract without ever having fired a shot. That was the mission. That was what success looked like. But if the mission failed, if, through bad luck or enemy skill, the patrol was compromised and contact was forced upon it, the worst possible outcome was to sound like 5 men. 5 men engaging a Viet Cong patrol or company sounded like 5 men. 5 rifles firing, a weight of fire that any experienced enemy commander would immediately recognize as a small reconnaissance element that could be fixed in place, encircled, and destroyed before it could be extracted. 5 men firing every weapon at maximum cyclic rate, with no suppressors limiting the muzzle blast and the muzzle report, producing the combined acoustic signature of a force that sounded to anyone within earshot like a full infantry platoon at minimum, and possibly a company, gave the patrol the 30 seconds of enemy hesitation and confusion that were the difference between a clean break contact and an encirclement. The modification was not about firepower in any conventional sense. It was about information management at the most primitive and immediate level, controlling what the enemy believed about what it had walked into in the first critical seconds of contact, before the shooting died down enough for anyone to start counting. Each soldier had assembled his own load-carrying equipment from whatever combination of American, British, Australian, and locally purchased and locally fabricated components best served the single overriding requirement: eliminate every possible source of sound produced by the equipment itself. No standard configuration existed or was sought. No quartermaster's approval was requested or offered. Every metal buckle and every metal clip in the original Australian-issue webbing had been replaced with paracord ties or lengths of tape. Water was carried in soft plastic bladders rather than the metal canteens that were standard issue throughout the American military,
because a metal canteen making contact with a rifle stock or the edge of a belt buckle in the silence of the jungle at night produced a sound that carried further than the sound of boots on soft earth and the accumulated small sounds of equipment contact over hundreds of meters of movement could build a composite acoustic picture that told a trained listener exactly what was moving through the darkness, how many, how fast, and in which direction. Nothing on any man in the patrol made a sound against anything else. The sergeant made his offer casually, as if it were a routine part of introducing a visitor to how the patrol operated. He invited the American officer to walk 30 meters through the camp perimeter at a normal walking pace in his standard American field kit, while the 5-man patrol stood with their backs turned and simply listened. No timing, no scoring, just listening. The American accepted without hesitation. He had been a soldier for 20 years.
He knew how to move quietly. He placed his feet with deliberate care, avoiding the obvious debris on the ground, keeping his pace slow and controlled, employing every quiet movement technique that his years of training and experience had taught him. He was 40% of the way through the 30 meters, still moving, still confident, when the sergeant raised his hand and said that was enough. When the patrol turned around, the count that came back was 27 distinct and individually identifiable sounds in just under 15 meters of actual movement. The scrape of a metal buckle catching momentarily on the receiver of the rifle before releasing. The rhythmic, soft friction of stiff nylon trouser legs brushing against each other with the inside knee contact of a normal walking stride. The hollow percussion of boot heel making contact with packed earth at the moment of each step. The dog tags lifting from the chest with the slight forward lean of each pace and settling back against the sternum. A partially filled magazine shifting within its pouch by a fraction of a centimeter with the vibration of movement. Each sound was individually small. In the ambient noise of a functioning military base during the day, not one of them would have registered above the background. In the absolute silence of Vietnamese jungle at 3 in the morning, when the insect chorus had gone quiet, and the only sound was the sound you were making or the sound being made by something nearby, each of those 27 sounds was a piece of information. Together, they were a complete report on exactly what was moving through the darkness, transmitted to every trained ear within effective range long before any visual confirmation was possible. The patrol that this American officer had dismissed in his field journal as operating on superstition rather than science moved at the pace that the terrain and the mission required.
Sometimes this was 300 meters in a single hour of movement. Sometimes it was less. Sometimes it was a complete frozen halt for 40 minutes or longer, when the ambient sound of the jungle shifted in a way that men who had been living in that environment for days recognized as meaning something had changed nearby. Something had been disturbed. Something was present that had not been present before, and that the safest response was absolute stillness until the information resolved itself into something definitive. A war correspondent who accompanied an Australian infantry battalion patrol in Fuk Tui province at the height of the war wrote about the experience with a mixture of professional admiration and genuine personal frustration. The patrol, he reported, had taken 9 hours to sweep a single mile of terrain. They moved forward a few steps at a time, stopped, listened with the total attention of men for whom listening was a survival skill rather than a courtesy, then proceeded again. The Australians he was writing about did not experience this as slow. They experienced it as correct. The pace was not a symptom of excessive caution or institutional timidity. The pace was the instrument through which every other advantage they possessed was made available to them. Move faster,
and you announced yourself to the jungle before you could read it. Move at the pace the jungle required, and the jungle became yours. The patrol inserted on the first day of its 10-day mission at a landing zone chosen with considerable care, at a position 20 kilometers from the area in which they intended to operate. The reasoning behind this separation was the same reasoning that governed every other decision the patrol made. The sound of a helicopter in the Vietnamese jungle carries for distances that make acoustic concealment impossible, and the Viet Cong had long since learned to watch areas near recent helicopter insertions for the patrol that had been dropped.
Placing the landing point 20 kilometers from the actual objective severed the acoustic connection between the fact of insertion and the location of subsequent operations. The patrol walked the gap entirely on foot. Movement occurred only under cover of darkness, when the jungle's own sounds provided acoustic cover for whatever minimal noise the patrol produced, and when the absence of light made visual detection by any observer who had not heard them approaching effectively impossible. During the daylight hours, they lay completely motionless in natural depressions in the ground, covered in vegetation they had arranged and positioned before first light with the painstaking care of men for whom a single out-of-place shadow at midday represented a potentially fatal operational failure. 2 short bursts of coded radio static per day, transmitting nothing but the confirmation that they were alive and on schedule, with the patrol's only contact with the outside world. No voice communication. Each transmission was short enough that any direction-finding equipment the enemy might have had available could not obtain a useful fix on their position before the transmission ended. Reading the jungle as they moved through it was the heart and the purpose of the entire undertaking. Cut vines at chest height on either side of a gap in the undergrowth, the cuts still clean, and the vegetation not yet beginning the process of regrowing over the wound, indicating that someone had passed through this gap within the last 48 hours and had marked it for use as a trail. The elongated oval impression of Ho Chi Minh sandals, the simple footwear cut from the rubber of truck and vehicle tires that equipped virtually every Viet Cong fighter in the field, worn into a path over months of repeated use until the vegetation in the center of the track had been permanently killed and the exposed earth showed the compressed dark surface of heavily trafficked ground.
Ash in a fire pit that, when touched and assessed, proved to be the specific temperature of ash that is between 12 and 18 hours old, still holding fractionally more residual warmth than the ambient temperature of the surrounding soil. The enemy had been here recently. The patrol was moving in the right direction. By the 4th day, with the patrol having covered approximately 12 kilometers from the insertion point in a pattern designed to avoid detection while still gathering systematic intelligence about enemy movement in the area, the tracker had read a trail junction and provided an assessment that illustrated precisely why the capability was irreplaceable. A column of more than a dozen men had passed through the junction within the previous 6 hours. At least 2 of them were carrying substantially heavier loads than the others, based on the depth and altered angle of their footprints relative to the prints of the men moving before and behind them in the column, consistent with the loads required by heavy weapons or ammunition resupply. The column's direction of movement aligned with the known location of a supply cache 2 kilometers to the northeast. This was not inference or estimation. It was a reading of physical evidence that produced specific, actionable intelligence about enemy size, composition, timing, and destination. It was also completely invisible to every satellite image and aerial reconnaissance photograph and ground sensor that the Americans had deployed over the same terrain. The enemy was simultaneously adapting to the threat these patrols represented. 5 years of SASR operations in Fuk Tui had not left the 274th Regiment and the other Viet Cong formations in the province unchanged. By 1970, the regiment's observation elements had learned to identify the characteristic approach profiles of the Australian helicopter pilots who inserted and extracted SAS patrols,
and were positioning advance warning teams near likely landing zones to engage patrols shortly after they touched down, before they could move off the landing zone and into the concealing jungle. The SASR's operational response to this adaptation became known internally as the cowboy insertion. A primary helicopter carrying the active patrol was followed closely by a second helicopter carrying a decoy patrol of equal size. Both aircraft landed at the same zone within seconds of each other. Both patrols moved away from the zone together for 5 full minutes, establishing a shared movement path that any observer tracking them would record as a single force. Then the decoy element stopped and waited while the primary patrol continued on its actual mission. After another 5 minutes of silence with no enemy contact, the decoy returned to the landing zone and was extracted. Any Viet Cong observer who had positioned himself to track the insertion would record 2 patrols landing and 1 extracting from the same zone, with no reliable way to determine which direction the remaining active patrol had moved from the point where the 2 forces had separated. Every tactical adaptation the enemy developed in response to SASR methods, the regiment answered with a counter-adaptation. The silence was never a permanent inheritance from superior doctrine. It was a continuous operational contest fought in real time across the entire 6 years of the deployment. The crisis that produced the most consequential intelligence of the entire campaign arrived on the 6th day of the patrol's mission, without an observer present, deep in terrain that most maps of the period described only in the vaguest terms.
4 days of systematic tracking had moved the probability of finding the 274th Regiment's main operating base from a general intelligence assessment to something approaching certainty. A trail junction used by multiple columns within the preceding 48 hours. Evidence of a permanent water point serving a force too large and too static to be a moving column. The faint but distinctive acoustic signature of a small generator operating at a fixed point approximately 2 kilometers to the north-northeast. The patrol was close enough that the intelligence they had accumulated would, if transmitted and acted upon, reshape the operational landscape of the entire province. They were also close enough that the regiment's own tracker teams had identified their presence. The evidence was a single fresh track, no more than 2 hours old by the moisture content and compression of the disturbed soil, moving parallel to the patrol's line of march before beginning the gradual curving arc that distinguished a man following a trail from a man who had happened to move in the same general direction. The patrol was being followed by someone who knew his business. 5 men in the Ma Rung Mountains, operating entirely beyond the range of the artillery at Nui Dat, with a force of 900 enemy soldiers capable of being concentrated on their position within hours, faced an operational choice that no training manual had a formula for resolving satisfactorily. Withdraw toward the range of the artillery and lose the intelligence that 3 years of patrolling had been building toward. Or use the one tactical option that exploited every advantage the patrol possessed simultaneously. The patrol commander read the track, assessed the terrain ahead of them, and made his decision. Moving with the particular deliberate care of men who need to be followed without appearing to know they are being followed. They left behind them the subtle and carefully calibrated evidence of passage that a skilled tracker would find convincing. A boot impression in soft earth that had been imperfectly covered, suggesting carelessness rather than concealment. A bent stem at knee height that would recover within a few hours, but was currently legible to anyone examining the undergrowth for sign. The faint compressed line through low ground cover that indicated direction of travel to a reader who knew what to look for. They were constructing a trail for the tracker behind them to follow, and they were leading it toward ground they had selected with the same care with which they had selected every position they had occupied over the previous 6 days. The hill ahead was small, defensible on 3 of its 4 approaches, with natural depression in its crest that would provide the patrol some protection from the one form of support
that might save them if what they were planning proceeded to its logical conclusion. Artillery fire delivered onto their own position. On the morning of the 7th day, the patrol completed its preparation of the hilltop position, and the 274th arrived to do what the tracker's report had told its commanders was possible: close with and destroy a small Allied reconnaissance element that had penetrated too deeply into the regiment's operating area and now had nowhere left to go. The patrol commander, observing through the vegetation as the enemy deployed, counted the movement of more than 100 men executing a professional envelopment. A frontal element to fix the patrol on the hilltop, flanking elements moving to encircle it from both sides simultaneously, and a support by fire position establishing a heavy machine gun at the elevation that gave it the best angle across the crest. 100 against 5.
The claymore mines that the patrol had positioned during the night in a carefully calculated arc around the approaches to their position were the first and most decisive response. And when the lead elements of the frontal assault reached the 40-meter line from the Australian position, the patrol commander triggered all 20 of them in a single coordinated detonation. The simultaneous blast tore through the compressed assault formation at waist height across its entire front, steel ball bearings moving at velocities that the human body at that range does not survive. The assault stopped entirely. Then it reorganized, because the 274th was not a formation that broke and scattered on its first significant loss, and the second charge that followed was made by men who were angry and who knew that their numerical advantage was overwhelming once the initial shock was absorbed. The radio operator had been trying to reach the New Zealand artillery battery since the moment of first contact. 6 days in the humidity of the Ma Rung Mountains had done to the radio's battery terminals exactly what jungle humidity consistently does to unprotected electrical contacts: corroded them at the molecular level, building a layer of oxidation that introduced resistance at precisely the point where clean conductance was essential. The handset was producing static. The operator was working the terminals with the blade of his fighting knife, scraping oxidation from the contact surfaces with the focused precision of a man who was aware that he was simultaneously listening to the enemy closing on his position from 20 meters away and needed to complete this task before that distance became 10 meters. The patrol's rifles were firing at maximum cyclic rate, and in the acoustic environment of jungle undergrowth with no flash suppressors limiting the muzzle blast, the sound they produced was the sound of a force considerably larger than 5 men, which was exactly the purpose for which they had been modified. But acoustic deception at close range against a force that had already committed to its assault was not going to hold the position indefinitely. The terminal cleaned. The radio connected. 2 words went into the handset, spoken with the flat precision of a man reading coordinates from a map. Danger close. 30 kilometers to the south, the gunners of the 161st Battery, Royal New Zealand Artillery, who had been standing at their guns waiting through the silence of the previous days, with the particular focused readiness of men who understood what the call they were waiting for would mean, received the fire mission and began computing the solution. The 161st had not built its reputation in Fuk Tui by being a conventional artillery battery. It had built that reputation on one specific technical and professional capability: delivering accurate fire at distances and to positions that American artillery doctrine designated as beyond the boundary of acceptable risk to friendly forces. American fire support doctrine required a minimum safe distance of 300 meters between the impact point of friendly artillery fire and the nearest friendly position. The New Zealand gunners had refined their technique, their equipment maintenance, their calculation procedures, and their professional standards to the point where they could reliably place shells within 25 meters of a designated position at ranges exceeding 30 kilometers. The lethal radius of a 105 millimeter artillery shell on impact
extends approximately 40 meters in all directions from the point of detonation.
The gunners were working deliberately and precisely within that lethal radius, because the alternative was leaving 5 men to be overrun by a force 100 times their number, with no way out. The flight time for an artillery shell fired from 30 kilometers is 45 seconds from the moment the propellant charge ignites to the moment the round impacts the earth. In those 45 seconds, with the enemy at 10 meters and still coming, with grenades detonating on the slope below the hilltop crest and sending fragments through the air above the position, with the patrol commander transmitting fire correction data into the radio handset with the steady voice of a man who has arrived at a state of operational calm that exists on the other side of fear, the patrol held its perimeter. They held it through trust in men they had never met and would never meet, professionals 30 kilometers away who were doing their own work with equal precision and equal stakes. They held it through being exactly what their training and their regiment's history and 15 years of accumulated institutional understanding of what jungle warfare actually required had made them. Soldiers capable of continuing to function at the moment when the arithmetic of the situation had moved past the point where function should have been possible. The first salvo from the 161st arrived 50 meters from the patrol's position, and the jungle on the slope below the hilltop ceased to be jungle. It became a sequence of simultaneous events too close together and too large to process individually, each shell releasing its energy in all directions at once. The combined overpressure of multiple, near-simultaneous detonations transmitting through the air and the earth as a single physical force that the 5 men on the crest felt not as sound, but as pressure. A compression of the atmosphere around them, followed by the vacuum of the pressure wave's passage. For the next several minutes, the gunners walked their fire back and forth across the slope in a methodical pattern, while the patrol commander on the hilltop adjusted each salvo with corrections measured in tens of meters, bringing the wall of fire progressively closer until the heat of individual blasts was washing over the crest and small fragments from the outermost edge of the detonation patterns were landing in the earth within the position itself. When the final adjustment brought the rounds to the coordinates that the trajectory calculations classified as the absolute limit of what the gunners could deliver with confidence, the firing stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise had been. On the slope below the hilltop, the company from the 274th that had charged up that ground 60 seconds earlier had ceased to exist as a functioning military unit. The radio operator had a single wound on his thigh, a fragment from one of the last shells that had cut through the fabric of his trousers and grazed the surface of the skin without entering the muscle beneath it. He had transmitted corrections until the moment of ceasefire. The other 4 men were physically uninjured. The patrol reloaded, dressed the wound, drank water, and followed the retreating survivors of the company back into the mountains. The enemy, broken and disoriented, and moving with the specific carelessness of men who have stopped believing the jungle is watching them, was moving faster than security required. And a force moving faster than security requires leaves a trail that is easy to follow. They were going home. Home, for the 274th Viet Cong Regiment, was precisely where the Special Air Service Regiment had been trying to go for 3 years. For 3 more days, the patrol shadowed the column through the Mae Tao, staying close enough to read the trail clearly and far enough back that the survivors' own noise masked whatever sounds the patrol made in following them. On the 10th day, the final day of the mission before scheduled extraction, the patrol commander transmitted a set of coordinates and an intelligence summary that represented the accumulated dividend of 3 years of silent, patient, 9 hours to the mile reconnaissance by every SASR patrol that had operated in Fuk Tui province before them. The exact location of the 274th Regiment's main operating base in the Mae Tao Mountains, the positions of command bunkers
and their depth and construction, the layout of anti-aircraft positions protecting the base from air attack, the locations of supply depots, the schedule of guard rotations, the approximate size of the garrison. It was not a general assessment of probable enemy positions based on intercept data and pattern analysis. It was a blueprint produced by direct observation at close range over multiple days by men who had been standing close enough to read the structure of what they were looking at. The extraction helicopter touched down at Nui Dat, and the American liaison officer was standing on the tarmac. He had been informed of the patrol's scheduled return and had chosen to be present for it. The 5 men who came off the aircraft looked like the product of a process that had very little in common with any conventional understanding of what a military operation looked like from the outside. Their skin was sealed under a layer of dried residue from 10 days in the field. The mud and camouflage paste and organic material from the jungle floor compressed by movement and dried by the heat into something closer to a second skin than to ordinary dirt.
Their eyes held the particular quality of men who had not allowed themselves the luxury of full sleep for 10 consecutive days, attentive and slightly distant simultaneously. The eyes of men whose nervous systems had been operating at a sustained elevated state for longer than the body comfortably tolerates. The smell that reached the officer from 15 meters away as they crossed the tarmac was the smell of the floor of the Vietnamese jungle, the fermented and organic combination that he now understood was not a consequence of hardship endured, but a deliberate construction maintained. He did not step back. He walked across to the patrol commander and extended his hand. He said very little. The field journal entry he wrote that evening was not the entry of a man who had found a better weapon. It was the entry of a man who had understood, for the first time in 20 years of professional military service, that he had been asking the wrong question. The Australians were not asking how to kill more of the enemy efficiently. They were asking how to find the enemy with sufficient precision to act upon the finding. The distinction between those two questions was the entire war, rendered in miniature on a single hilltop in the Ma Rung Mountains. The formal report he sent to the Pentagon discussed what he had observed in the careful and appropriate language of an official communication. What he had actually learned moved through a different channel entirely. The Special Air Service Regiment had been providing instructors to the American military training system since 1967, first to the MACV Recondo School, and then to the Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol Training Wing at the Van Keep Training Center. American operators who spent time training alongside Australian instructors or on exchange with Australian units brought fragments of what they absorbed back into the American system. Vietnam-era Navy SEAL Roger Hayden, who had completed Army Ranger School and every American Special Forces qualification course available to him before his Vietnam deployment, stated after the war that he had learned more about reconnaissance craft in 10 days serving alongside the Australian SAS than he had learned from all his American military training taken together. Their fieldcraft was so good, he said, you had to have everything together to operate the way they did. The knowledge that institutional doctrine could not transmit traveled through the men who had been close enough to witness it operating under actual conditions. Operation Marsden, launched on the 3rd of December 1969 and concluded on the 28th of December, applied the intelligence produced by 3 years of SASR reconnaissance to the Viet Cong 5th Division's headquarters in the Ma Rung Mountains with a precision and effect that no previous operation directed against those mountains had achieved. The division that had operated throughout Fuk Tui province with effective impunity for years, that had evaded and absorbed every conventional search and destroy operation directed against its mountain sanctuaries, was struck in the specific locations where its command structure and supply network lived. The operation is recorded in the official history of the 1st Australian Task Force as among the most operationally successful undertaken during the entire deployment.
By 1971, Fuk Tui province had been substantially cleared of the local Viet Cong infrastructure that had controlled it for more than a decade. Highway 15, the main road running south through the province connecting Saigon to the port at Vung Tau, carried unescorted civilian traffic for the first time in years.
The strategic objective the Australians had been assigned when they arrived in the province in 1966 had been achieved to a degree unmatched in any comparable area of South Vietnam. It had been achieved not through the application of the firepower doctrine that the Americans had brought to the country at enormous expense and escalating cost in lives, but through 5-man patrols moving in the darkness at 9 hours to the mile, reading a manuscript written in a language that most armies had never considered worth the effort of learning. In April of 1975, Saigon fell. The province that 5 years of Australian patience had made measurably safer was absorbed into the collapse of the larger strategic failure that surrounded it on every side. The tactical achievement could not survive the strategic catastrophe, but the methods survived. The last SASR patrol in Vietnam had been completed on the 5th of October 1971. 5 days in duration. No contact with the enemy. The men flew home to Perth. Everything they had learned and refined and paid for came home with them. 2 years after the fall of Saigon, Colonel Charles Beckwith, who had served on exchange with the British Special Air Service in Malaya and understood at a level deeper than doctrine what small unit special reconnaissance could accomplish against a determined enemy in difficult terrain, was given the mandate and the resources to build a new American counterterrorism unit from the ground up. The founding philosophy of that unit, Delta Force, drew on the tradition that ran in an unbroken line through the British SAS in Malaya, through the SASR in Borneo, through the 5-man patrols that had spent 5 years making the Ma Rung Mountains readable. The connection is philosophical rather than purely archival, genuine rather than reducible to a single document. But it is real. The techniques that a visiting American officer had dismissed as primitive superstition in 1968 became the intellectual architecture of the most capable counterterrorism force the United States military has ever fielded. What could not be learned in time to save Vietnam was learned in time to build something that lasted. The soldiers themselves went home. Terry O'Farrell, who had completed 2 tours as an SASR soldier in Vietnam, had gone on 40 separate patrols behind enemy lines as forward scout and signaller and patrol commander, had been wounded twice, and had risen to the rank of major before leaving the army, returned to Perth and worked as a building contractor. He gave 1 interview of significance about his service and wrote 1 memoir about it, published years after the war. It was not read widely in the country that had needed most urgently to understand what he knew. David Horner's definitive history of the regiment, SAS Phantoms of the Jungle, was published in 1989, which is to say 18 years after the last Australian patrol came out of the Vietnamese jungle. 18 years for a story of this weight and consequence to be set down in permanent form. In Australia, it became a bestseller. In the United States, the country whose military had absorbed fragments of what it documented without ever fully crediting the source, it was barely noticed. The story was not hidden by a classification order or locked in a vault at the instruction of embarrassed senior officers. It was simply not looked for by the people who had the most reason to want to find it, which in some ways is a more complete form of suppression than the deliberate kind. 580 men served in the Special Air Service Regiment in Vietnam across 6 years of operations. They conducted nearly 1,200 patrols. They confirmed 492 enemy killed and captured 11 prisoners. Their own losses, to all causes, combat wounds, accident, and illness, totaled 7 men. Against the most capable and experienced jungle insurgent force of the 20th century,
at the cost of 7 lives across 6 years. They changed the fundamental architecture of how modern special operations forces understand their own purpose. The 274th Viet Cong Regiment entered the war in Fuk Tui at approximately 2,000 fighting strength. By the time Operation Marsden concluded in the last days of December 1969, it numbered 900. The difference was not produced by bombers or napalm or the industrial instruments of the firepower doctrine that had consumed the resources of the most powerful military in the world without solving the problem. It was produced by 5 men at a time, moving at 9 hours to the mile in the darkness of the Ma Rung Mountains, reading a manuscript that the enemy did not know was being read. The Viet Cong gave them a name that does not translate with full precision into English. Ma Rung, the phantoms of the jungle. Not dead men returned, but something the living jungle had produced itself, a presence that moved through terrain as if it had always belonged there, that could not be identified or located by any of the normal means available to the men whose territory it moved through, that appeared only in consequence and never in anticipation. Think about what it means for a military force to assign you a supernatural category rather than a tactical one. It means the tactical categories have been exhausted. It means that what you are doing has moved past the boundary of what the enemy's training and experience has prepared it to explain. It means you have become, in their understanding of the conflict, something that operates outside the rules of the war they came to fight.
When the American officer arrived at Nui Dat with his field journal and his settled professional certainties and his 2 decades of decorated service, he was watching the future of warfare being assembled one deliberate step at a time, at 9 hours to the mile, in silence so complete that the jungle itself could not distinguish it from its own. He could not hear it. He could not detect it with any instrument available to him. By the time he understood what he had witnessed, the men who had built it were already back in the darkness, reading the ground, following the sign, moving toward the next set of coordinates. That, in the end, was precisely the point. And now, you know.